Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Yoga Break It Down. I'm Yoga Suze. In this episode, we're going to be going over a pose called Half Moon Pose. That's the English translation. The Sanskrit name for it, so Sanskrit is the ancient language that these poses were originally referenced in. The Sanskrit name for this is Ardha Chandrasana. So this is a great opportunity for me to start to explain these Sanskrit names. So that word sounds very long, Ardha Chandrasana, but if you notice the end part of the word is asana. Asana translates to pose or position, and that's what we're doing in yoga, or poses or positions. The funny thing about that is we tend to think of a pose as something that is still, but in yoga we're actually always moving. The first part of the word is Ardha Chandra. So Ardha means half and Chandra means moon. Chandra is also a female name. You may know someone named Chandra, so you can let them know if they didn't know the Sanskrit origin of the word means moon. Really beautiful. I'm excited about going over this pose with you guys because it's a balance pose. Many people dread balance poses, or terrified of balance poses, think they suck at balance poses, but I'm going to show you some variations that are supportive and may give you the confidence in this pose, and you may end up finding that this position with the right support is easier than some other balance poses. For this first variation, we're going to be using a chair. I like to use a folding chair. If you have a folding chair, take the time to go get it. If you don't have a folding chair, the next best chair might be a kitchen or dining chair. One thing that's great about the folding chair is that there is minimum back area, so we can actually reach through, and this can be used for this pose and possibly some other poses in the future. For this variation, I'm placing this folding chair so that the side of it is against the wall. If the chair you are using has a full back instead of an open back as this does, I'm going to recommend turning the chair so the back of the chair is at the wall, because one option for this is actually bringing our hand over the edge of the chair to hold on to. So whichever side you're going to start with, you're going to turn that foot to point towards the chair. You want that foot parallel to the wall, and you want it 3 to 4 inches from the wall, and basically you're placing your foot butt distance from the wall. If you put your foot all the way against the wall, your butt is going to need space, and that's going to end up pushing your hips forward and creating instability. So leave 3 or 4 inches for your pelvis. Then you're probably going to bend in your knee. You may or may not. You're going to lean towards that chair and make contact with the fingers, the fist, the palm. As you do that, the back leg's going to start to reach back, and you're going to end up lifting those toes up off the floor. So this is all moving as is natural for you. So don't release the floor with the toes until you're ready to, etc. As you start to lift your back foot, you're going to rotate the torso so the front of the torso is facing the center of the room. Your shoulder blades, your shoulders are going to be more in line. The top hip is going to go over the lower hip. And you're wanting to work towards both sides of the pelvis and both sides of the shoulder blade to touch the wall. If you find that making room for your pelvis is preventing the shoulder blades from touching the wall, I'll just put it that way, don't force your shoulder blades to go to the wall. Maybe this is a rule of thumb. If the lower shoulder blade has touched the wall, then you should be able to rotate the rib cage to bring that upper shoulder blade to or towards the wall as well. If the lower shoulder blade is not touching, it may not. And mainly think about the torso being in line with your hips. We're going to be unfolding into this pose. We want to rotate that upper hip a little bit more, and we're going to keep coming back to that upper hip, because as soon as you don't have your mind's eye on it it starts to collapse forward again and that leg starts to lower. So rotate that upper hip open, flex in the back foot. And flexing means when you have that bend in the ankle, so foot, leg, opposed to when your toes are pointing out, that's pointing, flexed, pointing. So we want to have the foot flexed. Few reasons for that. So one is that exposes the heel, and we're focusing on extending the body in a couple directions. So we're extending out through the back heel, we're extending forward up through that raised leg, through the torso, and then out through the top of the head. So that flex foot helps extend. When you're pointing or relaxed, you feel a little less of an extension. Other reasons for flexing in the foot is it's supportive of the ankle and provides a stretch to the leg overall. Raise that leg a little higher and keep rotating that hip open. We're extending from the center of the body essentially out in all directions. So I talked about out through the heel, out through the head. Now you're lifting the upper arm. The lower arm is down towards the chair. And you're going to feel an extension from the center of the chest out through the shoulders, out through those arms. By extending from the center of the body out all of these directions, it helps with balance. It helps keep us in place. If we were only focusing on extending out through that back heel, we would end up falling over, probably, falling back, coming out of the pose. Whenever you are practicing yoga, when you are working on one side, always make sure that then you practice the pose on the other side. It is very common that we find that we're less flexible on one side than the other. And you're going to see that in me here as well. I'm definitely tight in my legs trying to do the pose one side compared to the other. So you always want to make sure to do each side once at least. But when you notice which side you're tighter on or need more practice in, for instance, this is a balance pose. So perhaps you're not so much looking at which side is tighter, but which side you struggle with balancing. You might end up practicing your better side one time and practicing the more challenging side 2 times to start to even that out a little bit more. And this is normal. It's reality for everyone. The next variation, we're going to be using the block, but we're still going to have that support of the wall. So with the chair was against the wall, and then we placed the foot butt distance from the wall. We're still going to have the foot butt distance from the wall, but then we also need the block that same distance so that when we come in contact with that block with the fingertips, the fist, or the palm, whichever works for your wrist and for your balance, then the wrist should be underneath the shoulder. So the block is approximately 6 inches forward from the toes, and again, butt distance, same distance, foot to the wall. So you have the foot parallel to the wall and the block parallel to the wall. Rotate the torso to face the middle of the room, and you want to get that lower shoulder blade to brush the wall, just brush the wall, and also the lower side of the pelvis. Then you're going to turn the torso open a little bit more. At that point, the upper shoulder blade and the upper side of the pelvis may touch the wall, but usually we make that adjustment a little bit later. You could then bend in the knee of what will be the standing leg, reach to the block, make contact with the block with the fingertips, the fist, or the palm, and then start to lift the back leg. Or you might rotate the torso fully, start to lift the leg as you're sliding along the wall and then making contact with the block. So play around with which approach seems more stabilizing. As you can see, I have the block at its highest height, and that's because our arm is shorter than our leg, so we need to compensate for it. If when you have your fingertips, palm, or fist in contact with the block, if you really feel like that has pushed your shoulder up higher than its corresponding hip, you can bend in the elbow a little bit to relax that lower shoulder and to adjust the height of your torso. When you're ready to come out of this side, just be cautious. So you might bend in the standing leg a little bit and lower the upper leg. you can sort of push into the block and slide up along the wall until your foot is ready to come down to the floor. Now we're going to do some variations in the middle of the room. We're going to start out with the most supportive. This one will be with support being on a knee though. So if that does not work for you, you can opt out of this variation. I'd say the supportive variations to go for would be those ones we just did at the wall. For those of you who are generally okay with being on your knees, I still recommend some type of cushioning. This area that I film in is carpeted, so it's plenty of cushion for my knees. When I'm in a studio where there's a solid floor, I either have some type of foam cushioning for my knees. You can take a different type of exercise mat that's a foam mat and crisscross it with your yoga mat so that it's just covering the center area for your knees. Or you can take a blanket that is relatively flat and fold it to the desired height to cushion your knees. But it is not worth enduring your knee against a hard floor, even with a yoga mat. A yoga mat is no cushioning at all. It's the purpose of the yoga mat is to designate your little space and to give you traction. So notice a difference here. When we were at the wall, I emphasized that I wanted your foot turned towards the block or turned towards the chair. Here, I want your knee pointing towards the center of the room. And this is an important distinction. Whichever of these variations you're doing, I want you to have the foot or the knee positioned correctly. It is really common when I'm teaching a class that I see people with the foot or the knee pointing the wrong way, and it can lead to an unstable pose. It can lead to not supportive alignment between the foot, the knee, and the hip, and can cause discomfort in one of those areas. And also it changes the stretch and what's happening with the hips. So please follow the directions for the foot or the knee. So the knee's pointing towards the center of the room like your torso will be if it's not yet. And then you can reach towards the mat or the floor here, or you can use a block. So I'm going to give some variations without a block. You can play around with the block if you'd like. So whichever knee is on the floor, you're going to be reaching over to that side, touching the floor with the fingertips, the fist, or the palm. You're going to start to lean towards that side, and you're going to start to lift up the opposite leg. Same extensions. I think one thing that's a little trickier to get used to here, to adjust into, is there will probably need to be a bend in the arm to bring the lower shoulder in line with the lower hip, to bring the torso and the hips in line, and play around with that. You can sort of see me playing around with that here. You can place your forearm on the floor, but that's likely going to bring the head down lower than that upper hip and bring you in a little bit of a diagonal. But if you feel most supportive there, go for it. You can also incorporate a block. So this is in the middle of the room, but similar to our dolphin side plank that we practiced in another episode, this is more 3D than what we did at the wall and what we'll eventually try in the middle of the room. Our lower leg is sort of like a kickstand, so it helps with our balance there. Some people like this option simply because you're closer to the floor. And so people who really struggle with balance, they feel off balance just by being further away from the floor. So sometimes this can correct that for you. The next way we're going to practice this is standing in the middle of the room with the block. You can also ditch the block and reach for the floor. Again, it's however you feel most balanced. If you feel like the block wobbles under you because you're holding it for dear life and it keeps wobbling, you might rather reach for the floor. The floor's further away, though, creates a bigger stretch in the legs as you reach for the floor. So you may need to consider bending in the standing leg if it's too much of a pull in the legs. And again, Why I like the block is that it raises the torso a little bit more, so you're more in line with that raised leg. For this one, you would probably bend in your standing leg, again, toes pointing towards the block. You would probably bend in your standing leg, reach to the block as your torso starts to face out towards the center of the room, then lift the back leg and move into your adjustments. Word of warning. Practicing this in the middle of the room is completely different than the support of the wall. You may have thought you had a lot of control when you were against the wall, and now you're going to find you really didn't. So, what you may be practicing in this pose is simply making contact with the block and barely lifting those back toes off the floor, breathing and watching the connection of your standing foot to the floor. That may be it. Your torso may be facing down towards the mat, down towards the block. You may be hunched. You may be all squiggly. And you're working on balance because you barely got that foot up off the floor. Remember, we're working on balance even when we stand on 2 feet. So whenever you're frustrated at practicing a balance pose that's on 1 foot, I recommend coming back to standing on 2 feet. Make sure to have those feet parallel, not turned out or turned in. Maybe a soft bend in your knees to relax the lower back. Have the shoulders relaxed, your eyes open or closed. Breathe and just watch the connection of the ball and heel of each foot to the floor. Notice if your connection to the floor changes. Sometimes we feel like when we're standing on 2 feet, when we tune into it, the weight distribution keeps circling, or maybe it goes from side to side, or maybe you clench your toes in desperation to stay upright. So coming back to standing on 2 feet is a great way to, cut that frustration from some attempts at balancing on 1 foot. With this option in the middle of the room, using the block or touching the floor, at any moment that you do feel balanced and you do feel like you get a couple breaths in and can go on to that third breath, then start to rotate the upper hip open, rotate the chest more to face the center of the room, work on your arms extending the 2 directions, flexing in the back raised foot, extending outwards, letting the jaw relax. This next way I'm demonstrating for you is my favorite way. It's how I think the pose is meant to be, though I've never seen it taught this way, in a book, in a class, in a video. I'm not saying people don't, I just haven't seen it. But by me spending time with this pose myself, I really like this option because it focuses on the balancing on the 1 foot, the 1 leg. Because I think we tend to use the hand support as a crutch and tend to lean into that part more than is intended in this pose. Our connecting to the block, the floor, the chair should always be a light support and really just a placement of the hand, the forearm, the hand, so that we can open in the chest and have that extension of the 2 arms. One way to come into this final variation is by touching the block first, touching the floor first. You may also come into it as you've had practice by simply standing, turning the torso, leaning forward a little bit, reaching the toes back, starting to be on those tippy toes, lean a little bit more to where the toes just barely come up off the floor. It's sort of like a cartwheel about to happen in slow motion, and breathing. And then possibly, lowering and raising, or maybe not, but just enjoying that balance from standing on the foot and leaning a little bit. Or you might come into the pose by making contact with the block or the floor first, opening up into the pose, and then letting go of that lower hand. So this one can really be a frustration generator. I highly recommend either committing to starting with your hand in contact with the block or floor, whichever one you liked best, or the starting from standing, but don't commit to going very far at all. Only tilting the torso so much that you barely get those toes up off the floor. Breathe and work on your rotations and extensions without lowering much. Confidence is achieving small attainable goals. That's what confidence is. So if we are in the habit of setting difficult goals and we do not achieve them, we will not have confidence. So please set small attainable goals. If you have found in practicing this pose that maybe you like the support of some of the variations, but because you extended too far with the rotation of the hip or the leg or the arms, that maybe you got a kink, you cramped up, had some discomfort, don't open, don't extend that much. Modify. It does not matter if your torso is not facing forward. It does not matter if your hip does not fully rotate open. So please modify for what works for you. You are not trying to look a certain way. You are simply trying to have even connection of the ball and the heel of the standing foot to the floor, to breathe, and to possibly raise the back foot a little bit. That's the whole goal. There are some great stretches in this that happen to look beautiful, but that's not your goal. That'll eventually come. Thank you for joining me this week for this episode of Yoga Break It Down. Please hit the subscribe button, the notification bell. Share this with people you know who need yoga, who need their hand held to start to get into yoga. This is for you, this is for them. Yoga is for everybody. So zoologists need yoga, pastry chefs need yoga, Jacksepticeye needs yoga, and you especially, baby, you need yoga. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.